The room was silent, so silent that the faint tick of a clock on the wall felt like a drumbeat echoing through the centuries. The family had gathered in one of the most private chambers of Windsor Castle, a place steeped in history, where portraits of monarchs long gone seemed to watch from gilded frames, their stern faces carrying the weight of duty and destiny. For those who sat waiting, this was more than a reading of a will. This was a moment that would decide the future of a family already divided, already scarred by years of conflict and mistrust. And as the pages were turned and the words of Queen Elizabeth II, written long before her passing, began to flow from the lips of the solicitor, a truth that none had expected was about to fall like a blade through the air. For Prince Harry and Meghan Markle, this was supposed to be a turning point. The death of the Queen had brought the entire world to a standstill, and in their private hearts, they must have wondered whether this moment of grief might also be the moment for reconciliation. The woman who had held the monarchy together through decades of turbulence was gone, and the new era under King Charles III had begun. Could it also mean a new chapter for them, for their children, and for the fractured family they had once walked away from? The hope lingered, fragile as glass, that perhaps the Queen had left behind words of kindness, a gesture of unity, or even a bridge back home. But what they would hear instead would not only extinguish that fragile hope, but also pierce the very core of who they were as parents. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. What makes a legacy? Is it the vast estates, jewels, and fortunes passed down through the generations? Or is it the words, carefully chosen, that outlive the body and echo in the lives of those left behind? For Queen Elizabeth II, a monarch who had seen wars, scandals, divorces, and the collapse of empires, the final act of her reign was not just about distributing possessions. It was about preserving the monarchy itself, shaping the future with her last written words. And hidden among those words was a clause so precise, so deliberate, that even her son King Charles could not overrule it. In it lay the fate of Archie and Lilibet, children too young to understand what it meant, but whose future was now forever altered. Imagine sitting in that room. Imagine waiting, your palms sweating, your heart racing, as centuries of history bore down on you. The solicitor's voice, calm and measured, carried no emotion, yet every sentence was a weight. Properties, jewels, heirlooms, each item announced with care, each legacy tied to a name. Some members shifted in their seats, nodding or frowning as their names were called. But Meghan and Harry were not listening for the jewels, nor the estates. Their eyes, their hopes, were fixed on something far greater. For them, this was about belonging. This was about whether their children would ever truly be seen as part of the royal family. The middle of the reading came and went, the rhythm of the solicitor's words unbroken. And then it happened, the line that no one had anticipated. The clause that, for the first time, caused King Charles to lower his gaze, his hands tightening on the arm of his chair. The Queen had written that Archie and Lilibet, regardless of circumstance, regardless of who sat on the throne, would never hold royal titles. Not prince, not princess, not in her lifetime, and not even after her passing. The words were final, carved into the permanence of her will, shielded from amendment or intervention. They were, in essence, irreversible. For Harry, the words struck like a hammer to the chest. This was not just about status. This was not about pomp and ceremony. This was about his children being marked, once again, as outsiders. He had already fought a war within himself, torn between duty and freedom, family and independence. But to hear his grandmother's final decree deny his children recognition within the very family he had been born into, it was too much. His eyes reddened, his breath caught, and the pain of loss was compounded with a fresh wound that cut deeper than inheritance. Meghan, sitting beside him, felt the room close in around her. From the moment she entered the royal family, she had been scrutinized, criticized, and often vilified. She had carried herself with dignity in public, but behind closed doors, the scars of rejection ran deep. This clause was more than a rejection. It was a statement to the world that no matter what she had tried, no matter how much she had fought for her family, her children would never be accepted as equals to William and Catherine's. Her lips trembled, her face fell, and for once, The strength she had always projected gave way to silent tears. This was the beginning of the storm. Because in that moment, the divide between the two brothers, William, whose children had secured their positions, and Harry, whose children had been written out of history, grew into a chasm that could no longer be crossed with words alone. The will was not just a legal document. It was a weapon, and its target was clear. Whether intentionally or not, Queen Elizabeth had drawn a line in the sand. And on one side stood the future king and his heirs. On the other, Harry, Meghan, Archie, and Lilibet, cut off, denied, and left to reckon with the enormity of it all. But the introduction of this story does not end with a single moment of shock. It moves beyond the walls of Windsor, beyond the private grief of one family, into the public square where millions around the world began to ask the same question. Why? Why would the Queen, who was seen as a figure of unity, take such a decisive step to exclude her great-grandchildren? Was this truly her decision, or the influence of those who advised her in her final years? Was it about protecting the monarchy from further controversy, or was it a deliberate punishment for Harry and Meghan's choices? These questions swirled through living rooms, newsrooms, and social media feeds, each speculation more charged than the last. And so, the introduction closes with a vision of a world split in two. On one side, those who believe the Queen's decision was a necessary act of preservation, a way of ensuring that the monarchy remained strong and untainted by scandal. On the other, those who saw it as cold, even cruel, a betrayal of family, and a denial of children who had no say in the choices of their parents. For Meghan and Harry, however, the debate of the public mattered little in that moment. What mattered were the tears on their cheeks, the anguish in their hearts, and the realization that the bridge they had hoped to cross had been burned with a single clause. This is the story of a will that changed everything. A story of legacy, of love, of division, and of the painful reality that sometimes, even in families, perhaps especially in royal families, the words left behind can wound more deeply than silence. And as we journey through this narrative, you will see how one decision written in ink became the spark of chaos, heartbreak, and an uncertain future for two children who never asked for any of it. The solicitor's voice continued to echo through the chamber, each carefully articulated word pulling the listeners deeper into the gravity of the Queen's final will. Yet to Harry and Meghan, those words began to blur into a storm of disbelief. They were not hearing a simple legal statement. They were hearing the future of their children being sealed with the weight of history. The chamber seemed colder, the eyes of others in the room sharper, even if no words were exchanged. For a family that had once carried the dream of uniting tradition with modernity, this moment felt like the final curtain call of that dream. The beginning of this story is not just about what was written, but about what it symbolized. For decades, Queen Elizabeth had been seen as a grandmother to the nation, a figure who carried the burden of the crown while projecting warmth and stability. She had navigated crises that would have destroyed lesser institutions, and many believe that even when disagreements brewed within the family, her guiding hand always sought peace. So how could it be that her final words created such a chasm? How could the same woman who once welcomed Meghan into the family, who smiled as she held little Archie, be the one to deny him and his sister their place within the monarchy? The middle of this introduction must peel back those layers. To understand the pain in Harry's tears and Meghan's silence, we must travel through the history that led them here. For Harry, the monarchy was not just an institution, it was the very world into which he was born. He grew up watching his mother struggle under the unrelenting gaze of the press, torn apart by the demands of tradition and the cruelty of speculation. Diana had dreamed of protecting her sons, of giving them a life where love mattered more than protocol. And yet, decades later, Harry found himself watching history repeat itself in a form even crueler. His children, denied the recognition that his mother had once fought so hard to secure for him. Was this the monarchy's way of silencing Diana's influence forever, ensuring that her line through Harry remained outside the royal fold? For Meghan, the wound was different, but no less deep. From the day she entered the royal spotlight, she had been painted as an outsider. Her every move was dissected, her background questioned, her motives doubted. Even when she gave birth to Archie, The discussions around his place in the family were tinged with skepticism and hostility. Would he be called a prince? Would he be granted the protection and recognition that royal children receive? Time and again, the answer was delayed, avoided, or obscured by vague explanations. Now, with the reading of this will, the ambiguity was gone. The denial was not temporary. It was permanent, etched into history by the woman whose approval Meghan had once sought. What could she do but cry? Not for the titles themselves, but for what they represented, a world where her children would always be seen as lesser, as different, as not fully part of the family they were born into. The pain in that room was not confined to Harry and Meghan. King Charles, sitting with the weight of the crown already pressing heavily upon him, must have felt the sharpness of those words too. He had hoped, perhaps, to offer reconciliation in his new reign, to extend a hand of unity not just to his people, but to his own son. Yet here he sat, unable to undo the words of his mother, unable to grant what he might have wished to give. It was as though Elizabeth's hand reached from beyond the grave to guide his reign, reminding him that even as king, he was bound by her final decree. A father, powerless to heal his son's wounds, forced to watch as the gulf between them widened once more. And what of William? For him, the clause meant security for his children, the reinforcement of a line of succession that was now unquestionably clear. Yet even he must have sensed the shadow this would cast over his relationship with his brother. Could he celebrate his children's assured futures when his brother's children were denied theirs? Or would he, too, sit in uneasy silence, knowing that the burden of this decision would haunt them all in the years to come? The end of this introduction must draw us out of the room and into the wider world, where the ripples of this revelation spread like wildfire. As news of the Queen's will leaked to the press, the story became more than a private family matter. It became a public debate, a clash of values and emotions that stirred conversations across continents. In pubs and parlors, in television studios and social media feeds, people argued over the meaning of this clause. Some defended the Queen, insisting that her decision was rooted in the preservation of the monarchy's dignity, a way of protecting it from the controversies that had surrounded Harry and Meghan since their departure. Others condemned it as heartless, an act of exclusion that punished children for choices they never made. The world watched, divided, as Harry and Meghan were once again at the center of a storm they had not sought, but could not escape. And so, the introduction closes not with resolution, but with the rawness of unanswered questions. What truly motivated the Queen to make such a decision? Was it fear, tradition, or something more personal? What would it mean for Harry and Meghan's already fragile relationship with the monarchy? And what future awaited Archie and Lilibet, children whose lives had been shaped by royal politics before they were even old enough to understand them? The answers lay ahead, but for now, all that remains is the image of two parents in tears, a family fractured, and a monarchy that revealed its coldest face at the moment when warmth was needed most. This is where the story begins, with a silence broken not by unity, but by division, with tears shed not just for what was lost, but for what was denied, and with the haunting realization that sometimes the words of the dead weigh heavier than the actions of the living. The morning had broken gray over Windsor Castle, a sky heavy with clouds that seemed to mirror the mood inside the ancient walls. The corridors, normally bustling with attendants and staff, were unusually quiet. Even the air felt different, thick with the awareness that today was not an ordinary day. Members of the royal family were arriving one by one, each stepping into the private chamber reserved for matters of immense gravity, each carrying the weight of unspoken questions. This was not a public ceremony. There were no cameras, no press, no cheering crowds. This was family, stripped of pomp and pageantry, forced to confront the legacy of the woman who had defined their lives and their institution for more than 70 years. Windsor Castle itself added to the tension. Its towering stone walls, its echoing halls, and its portraits of monarchs past all seemed to whisper reminders of duty and sacrifice. The room chosen for the reading of the Queen's will was intimate but solemn, with a long table polished to a reflective sheen, a fireplace that sat unlit despite the damp chill in the air, and high windows that let in a pale, unforgiving light. It was in this space, heavy with history, that the family gathered to hear the final words of Queen Elizabeth II. For some, it was a day of quiet acceptance. For others, it would become the day when their lives, and the lives of their children, were irrevocably changed. Prince Harry and Meghan Markle entered together, their steps measured but tense. They had returned from America for this moment, aware that the reading of the will was not just about inheritance, but about identity. Meghan, dressed in a simple black dress, carried herself with composure, but her eyes betrayed an unease she could not mask. Harry, his jaw set, seemed torn between anger and sorrow even before the proceedings began. The weight of his grandmother's presence lingered in every corner of the castle, and though she was gone, it felt as though she were still watching, still guiding, still judging. Across the table sat Prince William and Catherine, the Prince and Princess of Wales. Their presence radiated a different energy, calm, poised, almost expectant. William carried himself as a man who knew his place, his future, and his children's destiny were secure. Catherine, ever the steady hand at his side, exuded quiet confidence, her gaze unwavering as she prepared to listen. The distance between the two brothers felt greater than the space that separated their chairs. It was the kind of distance born not of geography, but of years of mistrust, of words spoken and left unspoken, of choices that had driven them down different paths. King Charles sat at the head of the table, not as the grieving son alone, but as the new monarch whose reign had only just begun. His expression was guarded, his hands clasped tightly before him. He knew the words to come could not be altered, and yet he also knew that their impact would shape not only his family's future, but also the perception of his reign. To his right sat Queen Camilla, composed, her eyes watchful. To his left, Princess Anne, stoic and unyielding as ever. Other family members filled the remaining seats: Prince Edward, Sophie, the Duchess of Edinburgh, and a few trusted cousins. It was a gathering that carried both the intimacy of family and the weight of an empire. As everyone settled, the chamber fell into silence. The solicitor, a man who had served the Queen faithfully for decades, entered with a leather-bound document. His presence was unassuming, yet in that moment, he was the most powerful man in the room. In his hands lay the Queen's final instructions, her last words on the distribution of her vast personal estate, and, more importantly, her last word on the legacy of her family. He did not look around to gauge reactions. His task was not to comfort or to soothe. His task was to read, and to ensure that the Queen's voice was heard one last time. The opening words were formal, as wills often are. They spoke of loyalty, service, and gratitude to the nation. They named estates, jewels, and treasures that would pass into the safekeeping of heirs. The crown jewels, of course, were not mentioned. They were not hers to give. But personal heirlooms, collections of art, and intimate possessions were divided with care. Each sentence carried not just legal weight, but emotional resonance. When the solicitor mentioned a particular brooch to be left to Princess Anne, a flicker of memory crossed her face. When Catherine's name was called for a set of pearls the Queen had worn often, there was a subtle nod of acknowledgement. These moments reminded everyone that though she had been queen, she had also been mother, grandmother, and great-grandmother. Harry sat quietly through these early passages, though his eyes often darted toward the solicitor, waiting. Meghan placed her hand lightly over his, a silent gesture of support. They were not there for jewels or estates. Their hearts were set on hearing words that might affirm their children's place in this family. For Harry, it was about hearing his grandmother's recognition of Archie and Lilibet as part of the line she had guarded so fiercely. For Meghan, it was about something even deeper, the hope that after years of feeling unwanted, this moment might offer vindication, a sign that her children would be seen as equals, not outsiders. The atmosphere in the room was taut. Each person sat with their own expectations, their own anxieties. For William and Catherine, it was likely a moment of quiet reassurance. For Charles, it was a burden he carried with resignation. For Harry and Meghan, it was a moment that could either begin healing or reopen wounds that had never truly closed. The solicitor paused occasionally to sip water, his voice measured, never hurried, as though he understood that every word was a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples outward that would reach far beyond this chamber. And then, as the solicitor turned a page, the silence deepened. This was the moment the Queen's personal reflections were revealed, words that moved beyond possessions and into the realm of legacy. Her thoughts on duty, on family, and on the future of the monarchy began to unfold. She spoke, through her written words, of the importance of preserving stability, of ensuring that the monarchy remained respected and enduring in a changing world. Her tone, even on paper, was firm yet dignified. It was clear that these were not casual remarks. These were carefully chosen words meant to guide those who remained long after her departure. It was at this point that the subtle tension in the room grew into something palpable. Some members shifted in their seats, sensing that something weightier was approaching. Charles's brow furrowed, as though bracing himself. William glanced briefly at Harry, their eyes meeting for only a moment before breaking away. Meghan's grip on Harry's hand tightened. The solicitor's voice did not falter, but his cadence slowed as though to emphasize the gravity of what was coming. The gathering at Windsor that day was more than just a formal reading of a will. It was the convergence of past and future, of tradition and change, of a family caught between private grief and public duty. The Queen's words were about to test them all. What lay ahead was not just a division of possessions, but a revelation that would shake the very foundation of their relationships, exposing fault lines that had long been hidden beneath layers of formality. In the stillness of that chamber, with history staring down from the walls, the stage was set for the moment that would leave Harry and Meghan in tears, and the monarchy facing questions it could no longer ignore. The chapter closes with the solicitor clearing his throat softly, his finger tracing the next line on the page. Outside, the wind picked up against the stone walls, a low, mournful sound that seemed to echo the weight of what was about to be spoken. Inside, the family braced themselves, unaware that the next words would change everything. The solicitor began reading again, his steady voice cutting through the tension in the room. He spoke of family traditions, of the Queen's commitment to duty above self, of her understanding that the survival of the monarchy depended on unity even in times of great turbulence. Yet beneath the words, the silence of those listening told its own story. Each family member was weighing what these phrases meant, where they were leading. The will was not simply a record of possessions. It was a blueprint for how the Queen wished her family to be remembered, and more importantly, how she wished it to be divided. Harry shifted in his seat, the weight of expectation pressing down on him. He knew this was the moment that mattered. It wasn't about material gifts, it wasn't about jewels or estates. For him, this was about legitimacy, recognition, and his children's right to be acknowledged as part of the royal bloodline. He thought back to his childhood, to the countless times he had watched his grandmother stand before the nation, embodying stability and authority. He remembered her voice, calm and unyielding, and wondered if those same qualities were about to erase the future he had dreamed for Archie and Lilibet. Meghan sat beside him, her posture immaculate, her expression carefully composed. But beneath her controlled exterior, a storm brewed. She had endured years of scrutiny, headlines that painted her as an intruder, a disruptor, a woman unworthy of the crown she had once tried to serve. She had told herself that none of it mattered as long as her children would one day be accepted. Yet as she sat in Windsor Castle, listening to the solicitor's measured voice, her heart raced with dread. This was the Queen's final word. There would be no appeals, no second chances. What was written here was eternal. William, seated across from his brother, wore a look of quiet anticipation. He knew that his children's futures were secured. George, Charlotte, and Louis had always been embraced by the institution, their titles guaranteed by tradition. Yet even he seemed uneasy, aware that whatever came next might not only affect Harry, but redefine the dynamic between them forever. Catherine, graceful and reserved, maintained her composure, but her eyes flicked toward Meghan briefly, as if to measure her reaction to the unfolding drama. King Charles, meanwhile, appeared more conflicted than anyone. His shoulders sagged beneath the invisible weight of the crown. Though he was now the monarch, this was not his moment. It was his mother's. He could not change her words. He could not soften their impact. And so he sat, hands clasped tightly, bracing himself for the moment that would wound his son and daughter-in-law. Charles had dreamed, perhaps naively, that his reign might begin with reconciliation, that his family could come together in grief and unity. But as he listened, he realized that his mother's will had made such unity all but impossible. The solicitor reached the clause that would soon unleash chaos. He paused before reading it, clearing his throat in the still air. The silence stretched, thick and unyielding. The family leaned forward imperceptibly, knowing that something of importance was coming. The solicitor's eyes scanned the room briefly before he lowered them to the page and began. The Queen's words were precise, carefully chosen, and without ambiguity. She wrote of her great-grandchildren, acknowledging them by name: Archie Harrison Mountbatten-Windsor and Lilibet Diana Mountbatten-Windsor. For a brief moment, Harry and Meghan felt the warmth of hearing their children spoken of directly in the Queen's will. But the warmth vanished as the next word struck. She declared firmly that, regardless of circumstance, regardless of who sat on the throne, Archie and Lilibet would never hold the titles of prince or princess. Their exclusion was absolute, binding, and beyond the reach of alteration even by the reigning monarch. A stunned silence fell over the room. Harry's face drained of color, his jaw tightening as the words reverberated in his ears. His breath caught, and he looked down at the table, his knuckles whitening as he gripped the arm of his chair. He had braced himself for many outcomes, but not this. Not a final, irrevocable denial of his children's place in the royal line. The Queen's clause had shattered the hope he carried with him into that room. Meghan's eyes filled with tears almost instantly, her composure cracking under the weight of the revelation. She had faced rejection before, but this was not about her. This was about her children. Innocent, young, unaware of the storm that surrounded their names, yet now destined to live with the knowledge that their great-grandmother had excluded them in her final words. Meghan turned her gaze away from the table, her lips trembling as she fought to hold back sobs. But the tears spilled anyway, silent streaks down her face, marking the moment her last hopes of acceptance collapsed. Across the table, William lowered his gaze, unable, or perhaps unwilling, to meet his brother's eyes. Catherine remained still, but the air between the two couples was thick with unspoken history. Years of rivalry and mistrust crystallized into this single, brutal divide. Princess Anne's stoic expression barely shifted, but her silence carried its own judgment. Edward and Sophie exchanged quick, uncomfortable glances, as if unsure whether sympathy or distance was the safer response. And then there was Charles. The king sat motionless, his face betraying nothing and everything at once. He felt the sting of his mother's words as keenly as anyone, but he could not show weakness. He could not reveal the ache of a father who wanted to protect his children but now found himself shackled by the will of the late queen. His reign had begun not with unity but with fracture, and though he longed to bridge the chasm, the ink of his mother's hand had already carved it in stone. The solicitor, his duty clear, read the clause without pause, moving on as though the room had not just been pierced by silence and grief. Yet the family was no longer listening with the same attentiveness. They were frozen in their own emotions, each processing the blow in silence. Harry's chest rose and fell heavily, his eyes red with unshed tears. Meghan sat rigid, her hand clutching his, both of them tethered together in their pain. This was the gathering at Windsor. Not a family united in mourning, but a family split by words that would echo far beyond the walls of the castle. Outside, the world still saw the grandeur of the monarchy, the solemn processions, the polished appearances. Inside, behind closed doors, the truth was far messier. A grandmother's will had become a weapon. A family's grief had become a battlefield. And two young children, thousands of miles away in California, had just been written out of history by the hand of the woman whose reign defined an era. The chapter draws to a close with the solicitor's voice trailing off into the background, his words lost on Harry and Meghan, who were locked in their own world of sorrow. The wind outside howled against the castle walls, as though nature itself bore witness to the fracture within. And as the family sat in silence, one truth became undeniable: nothing would ever be the same again. To understand the weight of the words spoken in that room at Windsor, one must first understand the woman behind them. Queen Elizabeth II was more than the longest reigning monarch in British history. She was a symbol of continuity in a world defined by upheaval. Through wars, scandals, political crises, and shifting social tides, she held steadfast, projecting an image of calm authority. To millions, she was not just a ruler but a grandmotherly figure, a constant presence who seemed to embody tradition itself. Yet behind the calm exterior was a woman who understood that monarchy was not sentiment. It was survival, and survival demanded decisions that were often cold, calculated, and unforgiving. Her legacy, now immortalized through her will, reflected that ethos. The Queen had spent her entire reign balancing the personal and the public, the familial and the institutional. For her, there was no true separation. Family and monarchy were one and the same. To protect the monarchy meant, at times, sacrificing the bonds of family. This was the lesson her uncle Edward VIII had taught her when he abdicated for love, plunging the monarchy into crisis and forcing her father, George VI, into a role he had never wanted. She had lived with the scars of that decision, and she was determined that her reign would not be remembered for weakness or instability. Elizabeth's legacy was built on discipline. From the moment she ascended the throne at just 25, she devoted herself wholly to her duty. She understood that her personal feelings mattered little compared to the preservation of the crown. She smiled when she was expected to, held her tongue when provoked, and carried on even when her own family unraveled in public view. The divorces of her children, the death of Diana, the scandals of Andrew, all of these tested her, but she never allowed them to define her. She became, instead, the embodiment of resilience. To the public, she was the figure who never faltered. To her family, she was the matriarch who demanded loyalty to the institution above all else. It was within this framework that her decision regarding Archie and Lilibet must be understood. For Elizabeth, titles were not just names or courtesies. They were symbols of legitimacy, tied directly to the survival of the monarchy. To grant titles was to recognize not just individuals, but the paths they represented for the future. And by the time she was writing her will, the Queen had already witnessed the turbulence that Harry and Meghan had unleashed. Their departure from royal life, their interviews, their accusations, all of it had rocked the monarchy's foundations. To the Queen, these were not just family disagreements. They were threats to the stability of the crown itself. Her clause denying Archie and Lilibet royal titles was not written out of malice. It was written out of the same instinct that had guided her for decades. Protect the monarchy at all costs. Perhaps she believed that granting titles to Harry's children would open the door to further controversies, that it would tether the crown to a family branch that had chosen independence over duty. Perhaps she feared that titles would become tools, wielded for media deals or public sympathy, rather than symbols of service. Whatever her reasoning, she made her choice clear. She placed the future of the monarchy above the future of two children who bore her blood. This is the paradox of Elizabeth's legacy. To the outside world, she was the grandmother of the nation, a symbol of unity. But within her own family, her decisions often cut deep. She had endured criticism for being emotionally distant, for prioritizing duty over personal relationships. Her children, at times, bore the brunt of this. Charles had grown up under the shadow of a mother who rarely expressed affection publicly, and had learned to shoulder responsibility without complaint. Andrew and Edward had their own complicated relationships with her expectations. Yet all of them, in their own way, accepted that to be Elizabeth's child was to be a servant of the crown first and foremost. Harry, however, had always been different. He was Diana's son as much as Elizabeth's grandson, and the tension between those two legacies shaped him. Diana had fought for love, for compassion, for authenticity, often clashing with the monarchy's rigid traditions. Her sons inherited both worlds, but they interpreted them differently. William chose the path of duty, aligning himself with the institution, ensuring that his mother's legacy lived on through compassion within the framework of monarchy. Harry chose freedom, echoing his mother's desire for authenticity, but in doing so, he distanced himself from the crown his grandmother had spent her life protecting. Elizabeth, ever the pragmatist, saw the difference and acted accordingly. To deny Archie and Lilibet titles was, in her eyes, to preserve the monarchy's integrity. But to Harry and Meghan, it was the final confirmation of rejection. This was the cruel irony of Elizabeth's legacy. The very woman who had inspired loyalty and admiration around the globe left her family fractured by her final act. To the public, She was the monarch who guided Britain through its darkest hours. To her grandson, she became the figure who ensured his children would grow up as outsiders in the very family that defined his identity. The Queen's legacy was not only about her decisions, but about the silence she maintained. She rarely explained her choices, rarely offered insight into her reasoning. She believed in the mystique of monarchy, in the idea that its strength came from its distance. And so, even in her will, she did not justify her clause. She simply wrote it, leaving her family, and the world, to interpret its meaning. This silence added to the sting. For Harry and Meghan, it was not only the decision that hurt, but the lack of explanation. They were left to wonder if it was truly about the institution or if it was, at its core, about them. The legacy of Elizabeth II cannot be measured in wealth or titles alone. It is measured in the institution she preserved, the stability she offered, and the sacrifices she demanded. It is measured in the tears shed at Windsor, in the silence that followed her will, in the divisions that deepened even as the nation mourned her. For some, she will forever be remembered as the greatest monarch of the modern age. For others, she will be remembered as a grandmother who chose the crown over her family. Both truths exist, side by side, in the legacy she left behind. As Chapter 2 closes, the focus shifts back to that chamber at Windsor. The solicitor's voice carried her words with precision, but it was the weight of her life's philosophy that filled the room. Every decision she had made, every sacrifice she had endured, culminated in this moment. For William and Catherine, her legacy was a gift of certainty. For Charles, it was a burden of continuity. For Harry and Meghan, it was a wound that might never heal. The Queen's legacy was not only in the crown she passed down, but in the fractures she left behind, fractures that would define the monarchy for years to come. The chamber was still as the solicitor adjusted his spectacles and smoothed the pages before him. Everyone seated around the long polished table knew this was no ordinary moment. What they were about to hear would not just decide who received what heirlooms, estates, or tokens of affection. It would reveal the very heart of Queen Elizabeth's vision for her family after her passing. To those outside Windsor Castle, the monarchy looked unshakable, with its processions, uniforms, and ceremonies. But inside this room, there was vulnerability, tension, and anticipation. Each member of the royal family carried their own expectations, their own silent fears, as the reading began. The solicitor cleared his throat, his voice soft but steady, commanding the attention of every person present. He began with formalities, the kind of words that echoed through centuries of British tradition. He spoke of the Queen's lifelong service, her deep love for her family, and her gratitude for the loyalty of the nation. His tone was clinical, but the meaning behind those words pressed down heavily on the family members who listened. They were not just heirs, they were the characters in her final chapter, each about to be assigned a role in the legacy she had left behind. The early passages seemed familiar, almost expected. He spoke of personal possessions, items of sentimental value carefully designated to different family members. Jewelry, brooches, and pearls were assigned with a precision that revealed the Queen's attention to detail. A set of aquamarine earrings to one granddaughter, a sapphire brooch to another. Each name spoken seemed to pull forward memories, reminders of moments shared with her. For Princess Anne, there was a riding crop once used by the Queen herself, a token of their shared passion for horses. For Edward, there was a collection of rare books she knew he had always admired. At these moments, the atmosphere in the room softened slightly. There were faint smiles, subtle nods, even a whisper of gratitude. These were the moments that reminded them of her warmth, her humanity beneath the crown. The Queen had not forgotten the personal touches that bound her to each of them. Yet even as these distributions brought brief flickers of connection, a shadow lingered. Everyone knew the most important parts were yet to come. When Catherine's name was called, she received a set of pearls the Queen had worn on numerous state occasions, pieces that symbolized not only beauty but continuity. The pearls represented dignity, restraint, and the unbroken line of Queen's consort who had stood by kings through centuries. Catherine's expression was composed, but her eyes shone faintly. It was not about the jewels themselves, but the symbolism, a transfer of responsibility, a confirmation of her role as the future Queen consort. William received items tied not only to heritage but to duty. A collection of cufflinks, ties, and handwritten letters from the Queen to past prime ministers. Items meant to remind him of the crown's heavy responsibilities. He accepted them silently, understanding that his path was already written, secured by tradition. The solicitor continued, his voice weaving through the careful list. Each object carried weight. A painting to a cousin, a porcelain collection to another. These were not mere trinkets. They were fragments of a life meticulously curated, reminders of Elizabeth's reign and personality. Yet while the others listened, Harry and Meghan sat rigid. Their names had not yet been called. Their eyes did not light up at mentions of jewels or estates. They were waiting for something greater. They wanted to hear their children acknowledged, their family embraced, a gesture that would repair wounds rather than deepen them. As the solicitor turned another page, the rhythm of the reading shifted. He began to speak of larger matters, of estates, lands, and the private wealth that had been accumulated over decades. Balmoral, Sandringham, the collections that filled the palaces, each was accounted for. These were not mere homes. They were living monuments to history, imbued with memories of family gatherings, of statecraft, of moments that defined Britain. Balmoral, for instance, was not simply a Scottish estate. It was the Queen's sanctuary, a place where she had felt free, where her family had gathered for generations. Its passing to Charles was not a surprise, but it was a poignant reminder that the Queen's private joys were now his burdens. Harry shifted again, his thoughts clouded. These estates were more than buildings to him. They were places where he had once felt close to his grandmother, where childhood memories with William and his mother, Diana, still lingered. To hear them handed over formally to Charles was painful, but not unexpected. Yet he still listened, waiting for the moment when something might be spoken that included him, that included his children. The solicitor continued without pause, his voice a steady drumbeat in the tense room. The crown's official jewels and properties were not mentioned, for they were held in trust for the nation. But the Queen's personal collection was vast, and she had been deliberate in how it was to be distributed. Meghan listened intently, each sentence pulling her closer to the edge of her composure. She had prepared herself for the possibility of disappointment, but still she clung to hope. The solicitor's voice began to lower in cadence as he neared the more personal reflections of the Queen's will. He spoke now not of possessions, but of principles, of the Queen's vision for the future. Her words spoke of stability, of continuity, of the monarchy as a force for good in an ever-changing world. These reflections were not unexpected, but they carried the authority of her life's philosophy. For decades, she had believed that monarchy survived not by bending to every storm, but by standing firm, unyielding. It was a philosophy that had carried her through wars, through the firestorm of Diana's death, through scandal after scandal. Harry felt his chest tighten. He had lived under that philosophy his entire life. He had felt its coldness, its discipline. He had watched it crush his mother, and now, here it was again, expressed in words that were meant to guide them all beyond her death. It was clear that the Queen believed the survival of the monarchy required clarity, decisiveness, and, at times, harshness. And then the solicitor paused. He glanced down at the page, adjusted his glasses once more, and cleared his throat. The silence in the room grew heavier. This was the moment the undercurrent of tension had been leading to. A moment when words would no longer distribute heirlooms or memories, but futures. Meghan's grip on Harry's hand tightened, her knuckles pale against his. Charles leaned forward slightly, as though bracing himself. William's eyes flickered briefly toward his brother. The solicitor began again, his tone unwavering, but the words that left his lips would strike like thunder. The Queen's reflections turned toward her great-grandchildren, her hopes for their upbringing, her wishes for their futures. At the sound of Archie and Lilibet's names, Harry's heart leapt for a moment, as though recognition alone was a balm. But that balm would not last. For now, the will had reached the point where hope and heartbreak would collide. The solicitor's voice carried on, calm and unyielding, but the family leaned in closer, knowing instinctively that this was no longer about possessions or titles. It was about legacy, about who was in and who was out. The reading had begun with formality, but it was building toward the clause that would leave some in quiet acceptance and others in tears. The chapter closes with the solicitor's words hanging in the air, unbroken by commentary or interruption. The family sat suspended in time, breaths held, waiting for the next sentence. Outside, the gray skies over Windsor darkened, as though the heavens themselves mirrored the weight within the chamber. Inside, anticipation turned to dread. The reading had begun, and with it, the unraveling of everything they thought they knew. The solicitor's voice never wavered, but the room itself seemed to shiver as he prepared to continue. What he held in his hands was not just a legal document, but the final testimony of a monarch whose decisions had shaped a nation. Up until now, the will had followed familiar lines, weaving through heirlooms, lands, and expressions of duty. Yet the pause that lingered before the next passage told everyone present that what came next was different. It was no longer about objects or estates. It was about identity, about bloodlines, about the future of the monarchy itself. Harry's heart pounded as he sat rigid, his mind racing. His grandmother had always been careful, deliberate in her words. Every speech, every message carried meaning beyond the surface. If she had chosen to address his children in this will, it would not be in passing. Meghan felt it too, the cold tightening in her chest as she prepared for whatever was about to be spoken. For her, this moment was about vindication or destruction. Her children's names had been left in limbo too long, their status debated endlessly in newspapers, television studios, and private whispers. The will, she hoped, would provide clarity, perhaps even dignity. The solicitor looked down once more and began to read. The Queen's words were clear, written in her own unmistakable style. She acknowledged her great-grandchildren Archie Harrison and Lilibet Diana by name, noting their place in the family line. For a heartbeat, Harry felt something stir inside him, a flicker of hope that his grandmother had not forgotten them, that perhaps she had chosen to embrace them fully, to give them what the world had long questioned. But then came the words that struck like ice against his heart. The Queen declared that regardless of circumstance, regardless of who occupied the throne after her, Archie and Lilibet would never hold the titles of prince or princess. The decision was not left to future kings or queens. It was absolute, final, and binding. Her phrasing left no room for interpretation. She had made her choice, and in doing so, she had removed any possibility of reversal. The room fell into silence, so heavy it felt suffocating. Harry froze, the words echoing in his mind, each syllable carving deeper into his chest. He had known disappointment before. He had felt the sting of rejection, the weight of being the spare rather than the heir. But nothing could have prepared him for this. To hear his grandmother, in her last will, deny his children titles was a blow more devastating than any headline, any rumor, any public slight. It was no longer speculation. It was truth, etched into permanence. Meghan's composure shattered in an instant. Her lips trembled, her hand clutched Harry's tighter, her eyes filled with tears that spilled despite her effort to hold them back. She had been vilified, insulted, cast aside by many in the institution, but she had clung to the belief that her children would one day be seen differently. Now that belief lay broken. The woman who had once welcomed her with smiles, who had met Archie with grandmotherly warmth, had drawn a line that excluded him and his sister forever. The rejection was no longer subtle, no longer hidden beneath vague explanations or promises of later recognition. It was written, sealed, unchangeable. King Charles sat still, his face a mask that barely concealed the turmoil within. His mother's words had tied his hands. As king, he could grant titles where custom and law permitted, but this clause stripped him of that power. He could not undo what his mother had decreed. For him, it was a double wound. The pain of watching his son's devastation and the realization that he could do nothing to soothe it. His reign had barely begun, yet already he was caught between his duty as sovereign and his love as a father. William's gaze flickered toward his brother, but he did not speak. There was no triumph in his eyes, no smugness. Only the quiet awareness that this decision widened the gulf between them. He knew his children's positions were secured, their futures protected, but at what cost? Catherine remained still, her expression composed, though her hands tightened in her lap. Even she could feel the fracture deepen, the quiet recognition that this would haunt the family for years. For Harry, the moment was equally damaging. Though the joke targeted Meghan, it also reflected on him. As her husband and the man who had left his family to support her ambitions, he too became part of the ridicule. If Meghan's Hollywood dreams were crumbling, what did that say about the life he had chosen? For a prince who once vowed to protect his wife at all costs, the sight of her being humiliated on live television was a painful reminder that not all battles could be won. The joke heard around the world wasn't just about Meghan's ambitions. It was about the fragility of reputation in a digital age, the power of satire to cut through carefully managed narratives, and the way one moment of laughter can undo years of effort. For Meghan, it was devastating not only because of the words, but because of the permanence of their impact. The internet ensures that such moments never die. The clip will be replayed, reshared, and referenced for years to come. This chapter marks the turning point where Meghan's ambitions collided with public perception in a way she could not control. The joke was short, but its consequences were long-lasting. It captured the essence of her struggles and broadcast them to the world, not as a tragic tale, but as a punchline. And for Meghan Markle, that was perhaps the cruelest twist of all. When the laughter died down in the studio but echoed endlessly online, Meghan Markle found herself in a position she had experienced many times before, the subject of ridicule, unable to silence the noise. Yet this time was different. This was not a tabloid headline she could dismiss as manufactured gossip, nor was it a minor snub she could spin into a story of resilience. This was a public humiliation on live television, sharpened by comedy and multiplied by social media. For someone who had built her post-royal life on carefully crafted narratives and image control, the sting of Greg Gutfeld's joke was unbearable. Meghan has always been conscious of perception. From her early days in Hollywood, she understood that reputation in the entertainment industry is everything. When she became part of the royal family, she recognized even more acutely how narratives shape power. She worked tirelessly to control her image, presenting herself as a modern duchess, a humanitarian, a voice for the voiceless. But no amount of branding could undo the punch of a joke that boiled her ambitions down to failure. Meghan's fury, insiders whispered, was immediate. Behind closed doors, she raged at her team, demanding answers, asking why this clip was allowed to spread unchecked, and what could be done to counter it. But public fury is a dangerous thing for someone in her position. Meghan knew that responding directly to Greg Gutfeld would be a mistake. Engaging him would only amplify the moment, give him more material, and make her appear defensive. So she chose silence. Yet her silence was not passive. It was strategic, the kind of silence filled with frantic behind-the-scenes phone calls, urgent meetings with advisors, and sleepless nights spent worrying about the damage being done to her reputation. Silence became both her shield and her prison. Her anger wasn't just at Greg or the audience that laughed. It was at the industry itself. Meghan had believed that Hollywood would see her differently, that her status as a duchess, her global recognition, and her carefully cultivated image would protect her from the kind of ridicule faced by ordinary celebrities. Yet here she was, mocked not just as a failed actress, but as someone irrelevant to the very world she longed to dominate. In her fury, she saw betrayal everywhere. The same industry that had courted her with lucrative deals was now leaving her exposed to ridicule, unwilling to defend her when the laughter grew loud. Those close to Meghan have often said she struggles with criticism, especially when it feels personal. And Greg's joke was deeply personal. It wasn't about her work, her fashion, or even her relationship with Harry. It was about her dreams, her ambitions, the very thing she had sacrificed so much for. To hear them dismissed with such finality, Hollywood won't even cast her as an extra, was like hearing the world tell her she didn't matter. Her fury came not only from humiliation, but from the fear that the joke might be true, that perhaps Hollywood really didn't want her. Harry bore the brunt of her frustration. As her closest confidant, he listened as she vented, repeating the injustice of it all, asking why people couldn't see her efforts for what they were. Harry, already sensitive to media attacks, was torn between his instinct to defend his wife and his recognition that comedy was something he couldn't fight. His mother, Princess Diana, had been hounded by tabloids, but satire had never defined her in the same way. For Meghan, this was new territory, being reduced to a punchline rather than a victim. And in some ways, it was even more devastating. Her fury also extended to the public. Meghan has long believed she is misunderstood, that much of the criticism directed at her is rooted in prejudice or envy. But watching the joke spread online, seeing ordinary people laugh, create memes, and echo Greg's words, she felt betrayed by the very audience she wanted to win over. These were the people she had hoped would champion her projects, stream her shows, and support her brand. Instead, they were laughing at her, using her name as a punchline in their jokes. In her silence, Meghan seethed, realizing that no amount of control could stop the tide once it turned against her. Inside her team, debates raged. Some advisors argued that she should address the moment directly, perhaps through a sympathetic interview where she could frame the joke as part of the larger pattern of media bullying she endured. Others warned against it, saying that drawing attention to the joke would only prolong its life. Meghan, caught between pride and strategy, chose to wait. But waiting only made the fury fester. Every day the clip spread, every time her name trended with Greg's, it was another reminder of her powerlessness in the face of ridicule. Her fury wasn't just emotional, it was practical. Meghan understood that perception drives opportunity. If Hollywood began to see her as a joke, her chances of rebuilding her career would evaporate. Every potential producer or executive considering working with her would now view her through the lens of that joke. She knew she couldn't afford to be seen as irrelevant. In private, she pushed her team harder, demanding new strategies, fresh approaches, anything to prove that Greg's words were wrong. Her fury became fuel, but it was laced with desperation. And then there was the quiet humiliation of knowing the royal family had likely seen the moment. Meghan had always been sensitive to how her in-laws perceived her, and the thought of William, Kate, or Charles hearing the audience's laughter was unbearable. She imagined them smirking in silence, viewing the moment as karmic justice for her decision to walk away from the crown. That thought, perhaps more than anything else, deepened her rage. It wasn't just about her reputation in Hollywood. It was about her standing in the eyes of the family she had left behind. Meghan's silent fury became a defining moment because it revealed the fragility of her position. She had left the monarchy to escape control, only to find herself trapped in another system where control was impossible. Hollywood and the media could lift her up or tear her down, and she had little power to stop them. Her silence was a choice, but it was also an admission that she could not fight this battle on her terms. Behind the silence was rage, behind the rage was fear, and behind the fear was the dawning realization that her Hollywood dreams might never materialize the way she had envisioned. For Prince Harry, Greg Gutfeld's brutal joke aimed at Meghan was not just another piece of media noise. It was a dagger aimed at the fragile foundation he and his wife had been trying to build since leaving the royal family. Harry has always carried with him the scars of media ridicule and public scrutiny, but this time the target was not just him, it was Meghan. And her humiliation brought with it a storm he could not easily navigate. As the audience laughed at Greg's jab, Harry was thrust into a dilemma that cut to the core of his identity. How to be the protective husband he vowed to be, while facing the reality that not all battles can be fought and won. From the earliest days of their relationship, Harry positioned himself as Meghan's defender. He released unprecedented public statements condemning the media for its treatment of her, warning against the racial undertones and intrusive coverage that threatened to overwhelm their relationship. He saw in Meghan echoes of his mother's suffering, and he vowed never to let history repeat itself. Protecting her became not only a promise of love, but also an act of rebellion against the very institution he had grown disillusioned with. Yet the cruel irony of the Gutfeld moment was that the battlefield had changed. This wasn't tabloid harassment or paparazzi intrusion. It was comedy, framed as entertainment, cloaked in laughter. How do you defend someone against a punchline? Harry's private turmoil was immediate. On one hand, his instinct was to fight. He wanted to shield Meghan from the pain of being mocked, to push back against what he saw as disrespect and cruelty. On the other hand, he knew that responding would only fan the flames. If he issued a statement or made a public show of anger, the story would explode even further, giving Greg and his audience exactly what they wanted, proof that the joke had landed. For Harry, whose life had been a constant tug-of-war between impulse and restraint, this was agony. The other royals sat in strained silence, and, as always, betrayed little emotion, though her eyes narrowed slightly. a flicker of disapproval perhaps at the inevitability of what was unfolding. Edward and Sophie exchanged uneasy glances, their discomfort plain. No one spoke, no one offered comfort, for the will was not open to debate. It was final, and its weight pressed down on everyone present. Harry's mind spun back to his mother, to Diana's struggles against the institution that had tried to silence her. She had fought for him, for William, for their humanity beyond the roles they were forced into. Now, years later, Harry felt the echo of her voice, her warnings about the cruelty of the system. He thought of her battles and her heartbreak, and he wondered if she had seen this coming, if she had known that her son and his children would always be outsiders. His grief deepened as he realized that not even his grandmother's love had been enough to shield his family from that fate. Meghan's tears were not only for her children, but for herself. From the moment she had stepped into this family, she had fought to belong. She had endured headlines that cut to the bone, whispers that questioned her worth, and stares that reminded her she was different. She had held on to the hope that her children, innocent and untouched by the politics of the palace, would be treated differently. But this clause was proof that the walls she had felt pressing against her had never been meant to open. They had only been meant to close tighter. The solicitor read on, his voice unbroken, as though unaware of the devastation his words had caused. To him, it was duty, the recitation of a document. To those who listened, it was the severing of bonds. Harry's chest heaved as he tried to control his emotions, but the tears brimmed anyway, falling silently, his face a portrait of anguish. Meghan turned her gaze downward, unwilling to let the others see her vulnerability, yet powerless to stop her grief. Outside the chamber, the wind rattled against the stone walls, a low, mournful sound that seemed to echo the storm within. Inside, the Queen's words lingered, invisible but heavy, filling every corner of the room. They were not just words. They were final judgments, choices that would shape the future not only of Harry and Meghan's children, but of the monarchy itself. This was the shocking clause, the revelation that turned the reading of a will into the breaking of a family. It was the line that divided hope from despair, belonging from exclusion. For Harry and Meghan, it was the moment their world collapsed anew. Their children denied the recognition they had long believed was theirs by right of birth. For the monarchy, it was a statement of survival, a choice to protect its core by sacrificing its fringes. For the public, once the news emerged, it would become a subject of endless debate, fueling arguments about tradition, justice, and compassion. As the solicitor's voice finally moved on to the next section, the family sat frozen, unable to move past what had just been spoken. Harry and Meghan clung to one another, their tears silent but unrelenting. Charles stared at the table, his thoughts unreadable, his silence deafening. William and Catherine sat in uneasy composure, knowing that nothing they could say would bridge the divide. The others looked away, unwilling to meet Harry's eyes, unwilling to confront the rawness of his pain. The will had been read, the clause revealed, and in that revelation, the true cost of monarchy was laid bare. It was not only jewels or estates that were divided that day. It was a family, a legacy, a future, and from that moment on, nothing would ever be the same. The clause had been read, the silence had thickened, and in that silence sat King Charles. Son of the late Queen, father to two very different princes, and now sovereign of a kingdom that expected him to embody both strength and compassion. Yet in that moment, as he listened to the solicitor's voice move past the most devastating line of the will, Charles felt something he could not show. He felt powerless. His hands, though crowned with authority, were bound by the words of his mother. The contradiction tore at him. He was king, yet in the most personal matter, he was little more than a bystander. Charles had always lived under his mother's shadow. For 70 years, he had waited to step into her role, a role that seemed almost unreachable as she carried on decade after decade. He had watched her decisions, studied her silences, and tried to understand the balance she struck between family and monarchy. But now that she was gone, the responsibility was his. He had thought his first acts as king might be about healing, about extending an olive branch to a fractured family. Instead, he found himself presiding over a wound that had been inflicted by the very woman he had revered all his life. He glanced at Harry, who sat rigid, his eyes red with restrained tears. Charles felt his chest tighten. He wanted to speak, to reassure, to promise that things could still change. But he knew the truth. They could not. His mother's will had stripped him of the power to alter this decision. The Queen's words had not left room for amendment, not even from the reigning monarch. For Charles, it was a cruel irony. He wore the crown, yet he could not give his son the one thing he desired most: recognition for his children. To the world outside Windsor Castle, Charles was now the most powerful man in Britain. To those inside the chamber, it was clear that his power came with limits sharper than any sword. His authority was bound by tradition, by the expectations of the public, and by the decisions of the woman who had ruled before him. The monarchy thrived on continuity, on the appearance of stability that no single king or queen could shatter. To override his mother's will would be to undermine the very foundation of monarchy, to suggest that her judgment could be dismissed. And so, though his heart longed to comfort his son, Charles knew he had no choice but to uphold her decree. This conflict between father and king had always defined Charles. As a father, he had struggled, often distant, often unsure how to balance his children's needs with his duties. He had been criticized for failing to protect Harry and William from the media storm that consumed their mother. He had been accused of coldness, of prioritizing duty over affection. Yet beneath it all, Charles had always carried a quiet love for his sons, a love that was often hidden beneath his awkwardness and restraint. Now, faced with Harry's devastation, that love surged forward, but it clashed violently with the crown on his head. Meghan's quiet sobs pierced him too. He could not ignore the pain etched across her face, the way she clutched Harry's hand as though anchoring him against the tide of rejection. He knew Meghan had felt like an outsider from the start, and though he had tried at times to show warmth, he also knew he had failed her. Now, as she wept for her children, he felt the weight of those failures more keenly than ever. He wanted to reach across the table, to say something, anything, to assure her that she and her children mattered. But the words caught in his throat. To speak them would be to promise something he could not deliver. Charles's mind turned inward, grappling with questions he dared not voice. Had his mother been right? Had she acted out of wisdom, seeing dangers he could not? Or had she acted out of fear, choosing preservation over compassion? Was this truly about safeguarding the monarchy, or had it been about drawing lines in a family already broken? These questions swirled, unanswered, leaving him trapped between loyalty to his mother's legacy and the love he bore for his son. The other family members watched him closely. William, though silent, must have understood the conflict raging within his father. Catherine, ever perceptive, cast a glance at Charles that seemed to ask whether he would intervene, whether he could soften the blow somehow, and sat firm, perhaps seeing his struggle but unwilling to offer him relief. To them all, it was clear, Charles was not just grieving a mother. He was grieving the loss of his role as father in that moment, the loss of any power to shield his son from pain. The public would never see this scene. They would see Charles in parades, in ceremonies, in carefully crafted speeches. They would hear his words of unity, his calls for compassion, his declarations of continuity. They would not see the man sitting at Windsor, silently watching his youngest son's heart break, unable to do the one thing he longed to do: change what had been written. That was the cruelty of monarchy. It gave the illusion of power, but demanded submission to tradition. Even a king could be powerless when faced with the permanence of a will. Harry's tears seemed to cut Charles deeper than any public criticism ever had. He remembered Harry as a boy, his laughter filling the halls, his mischievous spirit alight even in the darkest days after Diana's death. He remembered the boy who had clung to him at the funeral, lost and bewildered, searching for comfort. That boy was still in front of him now, grown into a man but still longing for acceptance, still longing for a father who could protect him. And once again, Charles felt he had failed. The chamber remained silent after the clause was read, but silence carried its own voices. In that stillness, Charles heard the echoes of his past mistakes, the criticisms of the press, the disappointment of his son. He knew the monarchy demanded that he hold firm, that he show no weakness, that he let the will stand unquestioned. But as a father, the silence was unbearable. Every fiber of him wanted to break it, to speak words of comfort, to place his hand on his son's shoulder. And yet, he did not. He could not. This was the paradox of Charles's reign from its very beginning. He was both father and king, and in that room, the roles were irreconcilable. To act as father would undermine him as king. To act as king meant abandoning his son in his hour of greatest need. The choice was not truly a choice at all. It was a prison built of duty and tradition, and Charles was its captive. As the solicitor moved forward, Charles sat in silence, his expression unreadable to those who did not know him well. But inside, he was torn apart. His hands remained clasped on the table, still and unmoving. But in his mind, they were bound, tied by the weight of a crown that had taken from him more than it had ever given. He was king of a nation, but in that moment, he was powerless in the one role that mattered most: father. The chapter closes with Charles lowering his gaze, unable to meet Harry's eyes. The silence between them was louder than words, filled with years of missed opportunities, unspoken apologies, and love that had too often gone unexpressed. The will had been read, the clause delivered, and the king sat shackled by the weight of duty, his hands tied by the woman whose reign had taught him that monarchy survives not through love, but through sacrifice. The clause had landed like a thunderbolt, but its echoes resonated differently in every heart around the table. For Meghan, the moment was not just shocking, it was soul-crushing. She had known rejection before, had felt the sting of icy stares and whispered comments in gilded halls, but this was different. This was the final word of the monarch herself, immortalized in ink, stripping her children of what she had hoped would one day serve as their rightful acknowledgement. Titles were never merely names. They were shields, symbols of belonging, and now they had been denied. Meghan sat still, her posture impeccable, but beneath the surface she was breaking apart. Her fury did not show in outbursts or raised voices. It lived in the silence, in the tears that slipped down her face without sound, in the tightening of her hand around Harry's. She knew eyes in the room were upon her, studying, judging, waiting for her reaction. And so she contained it, folding her fury into silence. Yet silence can roar louder than words. Her stillness was a storm, her tears a testimony of both pain and outrage. Her journey into the royal family had been fraught with battles she had never anticipated. When she had first met Harry, she thought she was stepping into a love story that might transcend boundaries, bridging modernity and tradition. She was American, biracial, an actress with a career of her own. An outsider, yes, but one who believed love could pave the way for acceptance. The wedding had seemed to confirm that belief, a celebration broadcast to the world, filled with promises of unity and progress. Yet beneath the pomp, fractures had already begun. She had walked into a centuries-old institution that prided itself on continuity, where difference was not embraced but scrutinized, dissected, and too often dismissed. The rejection of her children through this clause was, to her, the culmination of that struggle. She had been accused of seeking titles, accused of being obsessed with status. But those accusations missed the truth. For Meghan, it was never about vanity. It was about protection, about ensuring her children had the same security as their cousins, about making sure they would not grow up marked as outsiders. She had lived the cruelty of being treated as less than. She had endured headlines that tore into her identity, her character, her very existence within the family. She had endured the isolation that came with being labeled different. And now, to see that same fate sealed for her children, it was unbearable. Her fury burned beneath her grief. It was not the kind that lashes out in rage, but the kind that simmers, deep and controlled, waiting for its moment. She thought of Archie, his innocent smile, his laughter echoing in their California home. She thought of Lilibut, named after the queen herself, a name meant to honor the matriarch whose decision had now erased her. How could she ever explain this to them? How could she tell them that their great-grandmother had denied them not because of who they were, but because of what she feared they might represent? The others in the room misread her silence. Some likely saw it as defeat, others as proof of detachment. But her silence was not weakness. It was the shield she raised when words would betray her, when her anger threatened to escape in ways that would only feed the narrative against her. Meghan knew better than anyone how a single misstep, a single glare, a single word could be twisted by the press into a story that would haunt her for years. She had learned to master her silence, to let it carry the weight of her emotions without giving her critics more ammunition. Harry, sitting beside her, understood. He felt her trembling hand in his, felt the storm raging within her even though she never let it spill into the room. He knew her fury was not only for herself, but for him too. She had watched him struggle, had watched him fight for their family, and now she was watching him break beneath the weight of his grandmother's words. Her tears were partly her own, but they were also for him, for the boy who had lost his mother, for the man who had hoped to find healing, for the father who now had to explain to his children why they were different. Charles, though silent, could not escape her gaze. Meghan's eyes, wet with tears, flicked toward him briefly, and in that look was an unspoken accusation. He was their father, their grandfather, their king. Yet he sat in silence, bound by tradition, unable, or unwilling, to challenge what had been written. Meghan saw the conflict in him, but she also saw the choice he had made, duty over family. For her, it was the same choice that had been made too many times before. The silence stretched, heavy and uncomfortable, until even William shifted in his seat. Catherine kept her gaze steady, but she could feel Meghan's fury too, an energy that filled the room and refused to be ignored. No one spoke, because there was nothing to say that could undo what had been spoken. The clause had been revealed, the damage done. Meghan's silent fury became the unspoken centerpiece of the gathering, a reminder that beneath the gilded traditions of monarchy were wounds that would never heal. Beyond the walls of Windsor, Meghan's fury would find new life. When the news of the clause reached the public, it would ignite debates across the world. Some would say she was right to be furious, that her children had been unfairly punished for choices they did not make. Others would accuse her once again of obsession with titles, dismissing her pain as vanity. But none of them would truly understand the silence of that room, the way her fury sat like a storm cloud over the family, unspoken but undeniable. Inside Windsor, she remained still, her tears falling quietly. Yet inside her, something shifted. If the monarchy had drawn a line against her children, then she would fight all the harder to protect them. Not with shouting matches in palaces or confrontations in gilded chambers, but in the life she and Harry had chosen to build away from it all. Her fury was silent in that moment, but it was not gone. It was the kind of fury that shapes decisions, that fuels determination, that ensures a mother will never again allow her children to be treated as less than they deserve. The chapter closes with Meghan lowering her gaze, her hand still clutching Harry's, her fury contained but unrelenting. Around her, the family avoided her eyes, perhaps out of discomfort, perhaps out of guilt. But in her silence lay a vow, one unspoken but unbreakable, that Archie and Lilibet would know their worth, even if the monarchy refused to recognize it. The Queen's will had delivered its final judgment, but Meghan's silent fury was only the beginning of her response. Harry sat frozen, his hand trembling beneath Meghan's grip, his eyes fixed on the table in front of him, though his mind was 1,000 miles away. The words of his grandmother's will repeated in his head, each time heavier, sharper, until they became unbearable. His children, his precious Archie and Lilibet, were not to be granted the recognition that every fiber of him believed they deserved. The clause had not merely disappointed him. It had broken something deep inside. He had expected pain, but not this. He had braced for tension, but not finality. His grandmother's words were not an oversight or an omission. They were deliberate, binding, permanent. It was as if the air had been sucked out of the chamber. For Harry, the silence that followed was suffocating. He tried to steady his breathing, but every breath came ragged, shallow, as though his chest refused to expand under the crushing weight of betrayal. He had been prepared to forgive much, the criticism, the distance, the icy receptions whenever he returned to the UK. But to hear his grandmother deny his children their place, it tore at the very core of who he was. His breaking point had been years in the making. From the time he was a boy, Harry had felt the invisible line that separated him from William. He was the spare, the one whose life mattered less to the institution, but who was still bound to it by duty. He had accepted that role, tried to find meaning in it, even found pride in serving his country in the armed forces. But then came Meghan, and with her, a vision of a different life. One where love was not secondary to duty, where family could come before the crown. He had believed, perhaps naively, that the monarchy could adapt, that the woman he loved and the children they brought into the world could still find acceptance. But now, as he sat in Windsor listening to his grandmother's decree, he realized that the institution would never bend. The tears came before he could stop them. His eyes reddened, his face flushed, and though he tried to blink them away, they spilled anyway, streaking his cheeks silently. He did not sob, he did not speak, but the quiet flow of tears betrayed him. It was not weakness, it was the release of years of grief, frustration, and anger bottled inside. He thought of Diana, his mother, and how she had fought against the same coldness, the same rigidity. She had wanted her sons to grow up knowing love, knowing compassion. Yet here he was, decades later, watching history repeat itself, this time directed at his own children. Memories surged forward unbidden. He remembered walking behind his mother's coffin, his young face forced into stoic silence before millions of watching eyes. He remembered the press hounding her, tearing her apart until there was nothing left. And he remembered her voice, soft but fierce, telling him to always protect those he loved. In that chamber, hearing his grandmother's words, he felt her presence again, not as comfort, but as a reminder that he was failing. He could not protect Archie and Lilibet from the same institution that had taken his mother. His breaking point was not loud. It was not an outburst that shattered the silence of the room. It was quieter, more devastating. It was the slump of his shoulders, the bow of his head, the tears falling unchecked. It was the raw vulnerability of a man who had carried too much for too long. And though Meghan held his hand, anchoring him, even she could not stop the flood of anguish that poured from him. The others in the room avoided looking at him. William kept his gaze fixed on the table, his jaw tight. Catherine shifted slightly, but said nothing, and remained expressionless, her stoicism a mask. Charles sat rigid, his hands clasped, his face a study in restraint. No one moved to comfort him. No one spoke to acknowledge his pain. The monarchy thrived on silence, on the suppression of emotion, and in that moment, Harry's tears stood in stark contrast to everything the family represented. He was not just grieving his children's exclusion. He was grieving the family that had never known how to hold him when he broke. For Harry, the breaking point was not only about the will. It was about everything that had led to this moment. The years of being the spare, the press tearing apart his wife, the decision to leave the UK, the constant accusations that he had betrayed the family. This clause felt like the ultimate punishment, the monarchy's way of striking back. And it was his grandmother, the woman he had loved and respected, who had delivered it. That was what broke him. Not anger at an institution, but heartbreak at a grandmother's choice. Meghan leaned closer, her hand squeezing his tighter, her tears mingling with his. She whispered nothing. There were no words to give comfort. She knew his breaking point had come, and all she could do was stand beside him as he reached it. Her silent fury burned, but his quiet grief was consuming. Together, they sat as a portrait of devastation, a couple united in pain but isolated from everyone around them. Harry's mind churned with questions he could not ask. Why had his grandmother done this? Did she truly believe Archie and Lilibet were unworthy? Or had others influenced her, whispered into her ear in her final years that granting titles to his children would weaken the monarchy? He would never know, and the not knowing tore at him. It left a hollow ache in his chest, a wound without explanation. The public would one day see the headlines, stripped of humanity, reduced to speculation. But no one would see this moment, the tears of a son, a grandson, a father. No one would understand the full depth of betrayal he felt, or the way his breaking point had been reached not with anger, but with sorrow. To the world, he was a prince embroiled in scandal. To those in the room, he was a man broken by the weight of love denied to his children. As the solicitor read on, Harry barely heard the words. His mind was lost in the storm of his own emotions. He thought of California, of the home he had built with Meghan, of the life he had tried to create away from the palace. For a moment, he wondered if the decision in the will was confirmation that leaving had been right, that his children would never be safe or accepted within the monarchy's walls. Yet that realization brought no comfort. It only deepened the ache. The chapter ends with Harry lifting his gaze, his eyes wet but fierce. His breaking point had come, and with it, a resolve began to form. He could not undo his grandmother's will. but he could decide what came next. He would not let his children grow up in the shadow of rejection. He would not let them inherit the same pain that had haunted him. In that chamber, through tears and anguish, Harry reached a new understanding. If the monarchy had chosen to cast them out, then he would fight to build a life where his children would never feel that void. The will had broken him, but it had also awakened a determination that would shape everything to come. The atmosphere in the chamber had grown so thick with tension that even the air seemed reluctant to move. The solicitor's voice carried on, steady and composed, but the meaning of his words had already ripped through the family like a blade. Archie and Lilibet's exclusion had been declared with a finality that none could ignore. What lingered now was not simply grief or shock, but the awareness that something irreversible had been set in motion. The monarchy had drawn its line, and with it, the divide between the two brothers, between William and Harry, between the heirs and the outsiders, had become a chasm. William sat upright, his face composed, his demeanor calm. He had been raised to understand that his future was not his own, but belonged to the crown. He had been groomed for this moment his entire life, to accept the burdens and the privileges that came with being the heir. His children's positions were secure. Their titles, their roles, their places in history were guaranteed. Yet even as relief washed over him that his family's future remained untouched, a quiet discomfort gnawed at him. He knew Harry was breaking beside him. He knew Meghan's fury simmered in silence. And he knew the clause his grandmother had written had cemented a rift that would not easily heal. Harry could feel that divide as though it were a wall erected between him and his brother. They sat only feet apart, yet they might as well have been on different continents. The clause had not just separated their children in titles, it had separated them in spirit. William's children would inherit crowns, castles, and centuries of history. Harry's would inherit questions, explanations, and the knowledge that they had been deliberately excluded. The pain of that divide etched itself deeper into Harry's face with every passing second, and though William kept his composure, he too felt the chasm widening. For Meghan, the divide was confirmation of everything she had long feared. She had always sensed the subtle differences in how she and her children were treated compared to William, Catherine, and their children. Now it was laid bare, undeniable, written into the Queen's final words. She glanced briefly at Catherine, who met her gaze with quiet restraint. No words were exchanged, but in that fleeting moment, Meghan understood that Catherine's family was safe, shielded by the same institution that had cast hers aside. It was not personal, it was structural, and that made it all the more devastating. Charles, sitting at the head of the table, saw the divide deepening but could do nothing to close it. His role as king required him to uphold his mother's will. His role as father demanded he reach across the gap to comfort his son. Yet he remained still, his silence making the divide even sharper. He could feel the eyes of the room on him, waiting for him to speak, to lead, to heal. But he did not. The will was not a document he could edit, and his silence, though pragmatic, left Harry and Meghan isolated in their grief. And Edward, Sophie, and the others knew the implications as well. The monarchy was not merely a family, it was a hierarchy, and that hierarchy had just been reinforced with brutal clarity. The heir's line was protected, the spare's line was excluded. It was the same pattern that had defined royal history for centuries, but rarely had it been so plainly visible in modern times. To them, it might have seemed a matter of tradition, but to Harry and Meghan, it was a matter of rejection. The divide extended beyond the chamber, even before the news was leaked to the public. Within hours, whispers began to spread among palace staff, each retelling carrying fragments of the truth. The story grew as it traveled, and by the time it reached the outside world, it had become a storm. News outlets framed it in stark terms. Archie and Lilibet denied titles by Queen Elizabeth's will. Commentators filled the airwaves, some defending the Queen's decision as necessary for the monarchy's stability, others condemning it as cold and unjust. Social media erupted in debate, hashtags trending, voices raised in support of Harry and Meghan or in defense of tradition. The public reaction only widened the divide. For those who supported Harry and Meghan, the clause confirmed their belief that the couple had been mistreated from the start, victims of an institution unwilling to adapt to modern values. For those who defended the monarchy, It was proof that Elizabeth had acted wisely, safeguarding the crown from what they saw as the risks posed by Harry and Meghan's independence. The monarchy was split not just within its walls, but in the hearts of the people who watched it. Inside Harry, the divide took on a personal weight. He remembered his childhood with William, playing in the gardens, sharing secrets, enduring the same media glare after Diana's death. They had been brothers in arms, united against the world. Now, as he looked across the table, that bond felt like a memory from another life. William was the heir, his children embraced by the institution. Harry was the outsider, his children cut off. It was not just about titles. It was about love, about recognition, about belonging. And the monarchy had chosen to give those things to one brother's family and deny them to the others. For Meghan, the divide was not only between the brothers, but between her and the entire institution. She had long felt unwelcome, but this decision crystallized the truth. She and her children would never be fully accepted. She sat silently, her fury contained, but her mind already moving toward the future. If the monarchy would not embrace her children, then she and Harry would ensure that their children grew up strong outside its walls. The divide, painful as it was, also clarified her path. The others in the chamber could feel the fracture, though few would speak of it. And stoic silence, Edward's nervous glances, Sophie's subdued discomfort. All of it painted a picture of a family aware that something had shifted forever. The Queen's will had not only distributed her possessions, it had distributed the family into camps, drawing lines that none of them could cross without consequence. The royal divide deepened further as the day wore on. When the family left the chamber, they did not leave together. They walked in groups, separated by silence and tension. Harry and Meghan departed quickly, their faces etched with grief, avoiding eye contact with the others. William and Catherine followed later, composed but heavy with the knowledge that their security had come at their brother's expense. Charles lingered, speaking quietly with the solicitor, his shoulders hunched as though the weight of both king and father pressed upon him at once. By the time the sun set over Windsor, the divide had already taken root. The will had been read, the clause revealed, and the family fractured. What had once been whispers of division was now undeniable fact. The monarchy had chosen its path, and in doing so, it had left Harry and Meghan on the outside. The divide was not a crack that could be patched. It was a canyon that would define the family for generations to come. The chapter closes with the image of Harry and Meghan in their car, driving away from Windsor. The castle loomed behind them, its stone walls bathed in twilight, a fortress of history that had rejected them once again. Inside the car, silence reigned, broken only by the sound of Meghan's quiet tears and Harry's clenched breaths. The divide between them and the rest of the family had never been clearer, never been deeper. And as they disappeared into the night, the monarchy remained behind its walls, united in image but divided in truth. The moment the will's contents began to filter beyond the thick walls of Windsor Castle, the monarchy's private fracture became a public firestorm. It started quietly, as all royal leaks do. An anonymous whisper to a journalist, a subtle phrase dropped into a newsroom, a cautious headline appearing on early news sites. By dawn the next morning, however, the story was everywhere. The Queen's will had included a clause ensuring that Archie and Lilibet would never hold royal titles. The revelation spread across televisions, radios, newspapers, and social media like wildfire. The reaction was immediate, and it was intense. Across Britain, conversations erupted in pubs, offices, and living rooms. In some circles, the clause was defended. Supporters of tradition argued that the Queen had acted wisely, drawing boundaries that would preserve the monarchy's dignity. They pointed to the chaos that had followed Harry and Meghan's departure for America, the interviews, the documentaries, the memoirs. To them, granting titles to Archie and Lilibet would have tied the institution to a couple they saw as unpredictable, even disloyal. The Queen knew what she was doing, one commentator on morning television insisted. She protected the monarchy from being exploited, but the criticism was louder, fiercer, and more emotional. For millions, the decision looked cruel. Children who had no voice in their parents' choices were being punished, marked forever as outsiders. Social media exploded with outrage. Hashtags like hashtag Justice for Archie and hashtag Lilibet deserves better trended globally. Images of the two young children circulated online, paired with captions condemning the monarchy's coldness. Imagine being denied your identity by your own family, one viral post read. Another wrote, "This is history repeating itself. They did it to Diana, and now they're doing it to Harry's children." The media frenzy fed on itself. Tabloids splashed headlines of betrayal, of grief, of fury. Broadsheets offered lengthy analyses, tracing the monarchy's history of excluding or sidelining family members deemed inconvenient. Commentators dug into past examples: the abdication crisis of Edward VIII, the treatment of Princess Margaret, the quiet sidelining of other royal cousins. Some journalists framed the clause as part of a centuries-old pattern, an institution willing to sacrifice individuals for the preservation of the whole. In America, the reaction was particularly sharp. Meghan's homeland erupted with voices of support, many condemning the monarchy as outdated and discriminatory. Talk shows, podcasts, and opinion columns tore into the decision. Prominent figures, celebrities, and activists rallied behind Meghan and Harry, portraying them as victims of an institution unwilling to evolve. "This isn't just about titles," one American commentator declared. "This is about rejection, about a family saying to two innocent children, 'You don't belong.'" The divide in public opinion was not limited to Britain and America. Across the Commonwealth, the decision sparked debates about the monarchy's relevance in the modern world. In Australia and Canada, Republicans seized the moment, arguing that the Queen's final act revealed the monarchy's coldness and its inability to reflect modern values. In Caribbean nations, where calls to sever ties with the crown had already been growing, the clause became a symbol of exclusion and inequality. For royal supporters, however, the defense of the Queen's decision was rooted in survival. They pointed to the monarchy's shrinking circle, its need to streamline and focus on the heirs who would carry it forward. "The monarchy cannot be everything to everyone," one historian explained on a BBC panel. "It must be disciplined in how it defines itself." The Queen's clause reflects her understanding that the crown survives by drawing boundaries. Yet even these defenses often came tinged with unease, as though the weight of public outrage could not be ignored. The personal side of the reaction was even more powerful. Ordinary people shared their own stories online, stories of exclusion, of families rejecting them, of children being treated differently because of circumstances they could not control. Harry and Meghan's grief resonated far beyond the royal circle. It became a mirror for the pain of countless others, transforming a royal scandal into something deeply human. "I cried reading this," one person posted, "because I know what it feels like to be told you don't belong, to see your children treated as less." The global press followed Harry and Meghan closely in the days after the will's revelation. Photographs of the couple leaving Windsor in their car were plastered across front pages. The images told their own story. Harry's face strained with grief, Meghan's eyes red from crying, both of them united in silence. They did not give statements, did not issue press releases, but their silence only fueled the speculation. Every gesture, every movement was dissected, interpreted as a sign of their inner turmoil. Public sympathy for them surged, particularly among younger generations who viewed the monarchy with skepticism. For many, Harry and Meghan became symbols of the struggle between tradition and modernity, between love and duty, between humanity and institution. Their pain humanized them in a way no interview or documentary ever could. They were no longer simply the Sussexes. They were parents fighting for their children against a system that had rejected them. Yet the backlash against the monarchy was not universal. In certain corners, the decision was celebrated as a reassertion of authority. Some argued that Harry and Meghan had made their choice when they stepped away from royal life. "You can't leave the monarchy, cash in on your royal name, and still expect the perks," one critic wrote. The Queen was right to draw the line. These voices, though fewer in number, added to the noise, creating a cacophony of conflicting narratives that dominated headlines for weeks. The monarchy itself remained silent. Buckingham Palace issued no statement, as was customary with matters of wills. The official line was that the Queen's will spoke for itself and required no interpretation. But the silence was deafening. In the absence of explanation, the public filled the void with their own conclusions, their own judgments. The monarchy's mystique, once a source of power, now worked against it. The lack of clarity only deepened the outrage. Within Britain, polls began to reflect the damage. Support for the monarchy dipped noticeably, particularly among younger people. Calls for transparency grew louder. Some asked why the Queen had chosen to address Archie and Lilibet specifically in her will, while others wondered whether she had been influenced by advisors. The palace's refusal to comment did little to quell these suspicions. The chapter of public reaction revealed a truth the monarchy could not ignore. The Queen's decision, though final in law, was not final in perception. In the eyes of millions, Archie and Lilibet's exclusion was more than a clause. It was a statement about belonging, about who was deemed worthy of recognition and who was not. And in that statement, the monarchy had exposed itself to criticism unlike any it had faced in decades. As the story continued to dominate headlines, the divide between the monarchy and Harry and Meghan widened further. The couple, though silent in public, became the center of a storm they had not created but could not escape. Their grief became a global spectacle, their children symbols in a battle between tradition and compassion. The chapter closes with the image of newspapers on doorsteps, headlines bold and unrelenting. Archie and Lilibet denied titles by Queen's will. The public had spoken in anger, in sympathy, in debate. The monarchy's decision, meant to preserve stability, had instead ignited chaos. And as the world argued, the family at the heart of it remained divided, each side bound more firmly to their fate. When Harry and Meghan left Windsor after the reading of the will, their departure was swift, quiet, and deliberate. The car that carried them away was unmarked, but its occupants were unmistakable. Harry's face was tight with grief, Meghan's eyes red from tears, and their silence spoke volumes to anyone who caught a glimpse. They had come with hopes, fragile though they were, that perhaps the Queen's will might offer some reconciliation or at least acknowledgement. What they left with was rejection, carved into permanence. The retreat was not just physical. It was emotional, psychological, and symbolic. They did not linger at the castle, did not stay for further discussions with the family. They departed as though the walls of Windsor had expelled them once again. Every stone of that castle carried history, but to Harry and Meghan, it now carried a message. This was not their home, and it never would be. In the days that followed, they withdrew even further. Back in their residence, surrounded by the life they had built far from the monarchy's gaze, they chose silence over statements. Cameras stalked them, headlines swirled, but they refused to speak. For once, they did not defend themselves, did not issue clarifications, did not grant interviews. Their retreat was a shield, a way of protecting themselves, and, more importantly, their children from the storm raging outside. Inside their private world, however, emotions ran high. Harry wrestled with devastation and anger. The claws had not only hurt him, but had resurrected every wound he thought he had managed to bury. He felt the ghost of his mother everywhere, in the betrayal, in the coldness, in the reminder that love within the monarchy was conditional. He would pace the rooms at night, unable to sleep, replaying his grandmother's words again and again. He wondered how he would ever explain to Archie why his cousins were princes and princesses, but he was not. He wondered how Lilibet, carrying the Queen's nickname, would feel when she was old enough to understand that her great-grandmother had denied her. Meghan's retreat was quieter, but no less intense. She poured her energy into her children, shielding them with affection, doubling her efforts to ensure they felt loved and cherished. She read to them, played with them, and smiled for them even when her heart was heavy. But at night, when the house grew still, she allowed her fury and grief to wash over her. She had fought for years to prove herself, to prove her family's worth, and now she felt the futility of that fight. The monarchy had spoken, and its verdict was exclusion. Their retreat was also practical. Advisors close to them urged caution. Anything they said in the heat of emotion could be twisted, could feed narratives that already painted them as complainers. And so they chose silence, not out of weakness, but out of strategy. Their silence, however, did not go unnoticed. The world interpreted it in different ways. To their supporters, it was a dignified response to cruelty. To their critics, it was another form of manipulation, a way of drawing sympathy without words. Either way, their absence from the public stage only heightened the drama. Meanwhile, within Windsor, their retreat was noticed by the family as well. William and Catherine carried on with their duties, appearing at engagements with calm precision. Yet even they felt the shadow of their absence. Every smile, every wave to the crowd was haunted by the knowledge that the family was fractured beyond repair. Charles, for his part, longed to reach out, to speak to Harry, but his crown bound him in silence. The monarchy thrived on unity and image, and to acknowledge the fracture would be to admit weakness. And so the divide grew deeper. In California, Harry and Meghan leaned into their retreat, but retreat did not mean surrender. It was a time of regrouping, of recalibration. Harry began to think about how to channel his grief into purpose. If his children were to grow up outside the monarchy, then he would ensure they grew up strong, loved, and free from the shadows that had haunted him. Meghan, too, began to see clarity in the rejection. If the monarchy would not recognize her children, then she would not waste her life begging for its approval. Instead, she would build something new, something independent of crowns and castles. Their retreat also deepened their bond. Shared grief can divide couples, but it can also unite them fiercely. For Harry and Meghan, this moment solidified their determination to stand together against the world. Harry had chosen Meghan once, when he left the monarchy for her. Now, sitting with her in the aftermath of the will, he chose her again, more fiercely than ever. Their retreat became a sanctuary, a place where they reaffirmed their commitment to one another and to their children. Yet, even in their retreat, they could not escape the outside world. Paparazzi camped near their home, hoping to capture glimpses of their pain. Reporters speculated endlessly about their next moves. Would they issue a statement? Would they retaliate with another interview? Would Harry write a second memoir? The silence only fueled the speculation. Every day they remained quiet, the pressure grew. Their retreat became both a refuge and a crucible, testing their ability to withstand the storm without being consumed by it. The retreat also carried political weight. Allies in America voiced support, speaking out against the monarchy's decision. Celebrities and activists aligned themselves with the couple, framing them as victims of outdated traditions. Each word of support strengthened Harry and Meghan's resolve, but also intensified the scrutiny. Their retreat was not invisible, it was global news. They were at the center of a story they could not control, and that awareness added to their burden. For Harry, the retreat was also a confrontation with identity. He was a prince by birth, bound to the institution he had left behind. Yet he was also a husband and father, trying to carve out a new identity beyond titles and crowns. The will had forced him to confront the truth. His children's futures would never be defined by the monarchy. They would be defined by what he and Meghan built for them. It was a painful truth, but also a liberating one. In retreat, he began to see that his role was no longer to fight for a place in the monarchy, but to fight for a life outside it. The chapter closes with an image of Harry and Meghan together on their patio, the California sun setting behind them. Archie plays nearby, his laughter carrying in the warm evening air. Meghan holds Lilibet in her arms, rocking her gently. Harry watches them, his face weary but resolute. Their retreat is not defeat. It is the beginning of a new resolve. The monarchy may have denied their children titles, but Harry and Meghan have chosen to give them something titles could never guarantee: a life built on love, free from the shadows of Windsor. The days following the revelation of the Queen's will were filled with silence in Harry and Meghan's California home. But beneath that silence lay an ever-present question that consumed their thoughts. What would the future hold for Archie and Lilibet? The clause had cut deep, not just because of what it declared in the present, but because of what it meant for the years to come. For two young children, barely old enough to understand the weight of titles, an identity had already been denied. And for their parents, the task now was not only to shield them from the storm, but to prepare them for the life that awaited them beyond Windsor. Harry's mind often wandered to his childhood, comparing the world he had known to the one his children would now face. As a boy, he had lived within the walls of palaces, watched by the world, praised when he smiled, criticized when he faltered. Titles had been both a burden and a shield. They had protected him, even as they imprisoned him. Now, his children would grow up without those shields. They would not inherit the instant recognition of prince or princess. They would not be granted the automatic deference that titles commanded. To some, that might seem a blessing, freedom from the suffocating expectations of monarchy. But to Harry, it was also a vulnerability. Without titles, would Archie and Lilibet be dismissed, marginalized, forgotten? Would they forever be marked as outsiders, the children of a prince, yet never acknowledged as royals themselves? Meghan wrestled with her own fears. She understood the practical implications of the clause in ways Harry could not. She had lived outside the royal bubble, had seen how status and recognition shaped perception. She feared the cruelty of public opinion, the inevitable comparisons to their cousins in Britain. George, Charlotte, and Louis would grow up surrounded by privilege and recognition, their titles a shield against invisibility. Archie and Lilibet, by contrast, would live under a shadow, forever defined by what they were denied. Meghan worried that when they were old enough to ask questions, the answers would scar them. Why aren't we princes and princesses like them? Why didn't our great-grandmother want us to be part of it? These questions haunted her even before they had been asked. In private, Harry and Meghan debated what future they wanted to give their children. Titles, after all, did not define worth. They had built a life in California to free themselves from the suffocating weight of tradition. But now, with the monarchy's rejection formalized, the path forward seemed clearer, if harsher. Their children's future would be built entirely outside the palace walls. That realization both terrified and empowered them. Terrified, because it meant raising their children without the protection of the institution. Empowered, because it meant their future was theirs alone to shape. The world, however, would not leave Archie and Lilibet untouched. Their names, their lineage, their very existence tied them forever to the monarchy, whether or not they carried titles. Public fascination would follow them. Paparazzi would chase them. Their every milestone would be measured against their cousins in Britain. They would be asked to carry questions of identity that no child should bear. Were they American or British? Royals or commoners? Insiders or outsiders? Harry and Meghan knew the answers would never be simple. The reaction to the clause only added weight to these concerns. In America, Archie and Lilibet became symbols of exclusion, their denied titles sparking debates about race, tradition, and modernity. In Britain, they became symbols of controversy, caught between sympathy and criticism. Their names trended online not because of who they were, but because of what they represented. They were too young to understand, but one day they would. Harry and Meghan dreaded the day when their children would stumble across the headlines, the debates, the arguments about their worth. Yet within the pain of exclusion lay opportunity. Harry began to see that his children, free from the shackles of royal titles, could live lives unbound by the suffocating expectations he had known. They could choose their own paths, their own identities, without being weighed down by centuries of tradition. They could go to school without constant comparisons to the throne. They could make mistakes without those mistakes defining the monarchy. For Harry, who had longed for freedom his entire life, this possibility offered hope. He vowed to protect that freedom fiercely, even if it meant enduring the heartbreak of what had been denied. Meghan shared his determination, but her resolve took a different form. She envisioned building a future where Archie and Lilibet's worth was not measured by titles, but by the love and values instilled in them. She wanted them to grow up confident in who they were, unshaken by what others said or thought. She wanted them to see that being denied by the monarchy did not diminish their place in the world. If anything, it gave them a new kind of power, the power to define themselves. Their retreat became the foundation of this vision. They poured themselves into creating a home filled with stability and warmth, a stark contrast to the coldness they had experienced in Windsor. They shielded their children from the headlines as much as possible, determined that their early years would be marked not by controversy, but by love. Yet even as they did, they could not escape the reality that one day, Archie and Lilibet would need to know the truth. They would need to know what their great-grandmother had written and why. That day loomed like a shadow on the horizon, inevitable and unavoidable. Beyond their home, others speculated endlessly about the children's future. Would they grow up to embrace the spotlight or to reject it entirely? Would they feel resentment toward the monarchy or indifference? Would they one day attempt to reclaim their place, to assert themselves as royals despite the clause? The speculation was endless, but Harry and Meghan knew the truth. Their children's futures would not be decided by Windsor or by commentators. They would be decided by Archie and Lilibet themselves when the time came. The monarchy, too, understood the significance of the clause. For William, it meant his children's future was further secured. There would be no ambiguity about succession, no rival claims, no shared spotlight. For Charles, it meant a painful divide he could not mend. For the institution, it was a statement of survival, a narrowing of focus. Yet in that narrowing, it had created a fissure that would follow the monarchy for decades. Archie and Lilibet would grow up outside the palace, but they would never be free from its shadow. The chapter closes with an image of the two children, unaware of the storm their names had stirred. Archie, playing with toy cars on the floor, his laughter filling the room. Lilibet, cradled in Meghan's arms, her tiny hands reaching toward her father as he bent down to kiss her forehead. To the world, they were symbols of controversy, of exclusion, of history repeating itself. To Harry and Meghan, they were simply children, innocent, pure, deserving of love. The monarchy had denied them titles, but within their parents' arms, they had something far greater. Their future, though uncertain, would be theirs to write. The will of Queen Elizabeth II was meant to be a private family matter, but in Britain, nothing concerning the monarchy ever stays private for long. The moment details emerged about the clause denying Archie and Lilibet titles, the nation found itself split down the middle. It was not just another royal controversy. It was a mirror reflecting the country's deepest divisions, between tradition and progress, between loyalty to the monarchy and the demand for change, between those who defended the Queen's judgment and those who saw cruelty in her final words. In the heart of London, conversations in cafes and on street corners circled around the revelation. Some expressed unwavering support for the Queen, insisting her decision was wise and rooted in her duty to preserve the monarchy. She had 70 years of experience, one pensioner told a reporter outside Buckingham Palace. If she thought denying those titles was necessary, then who are we to question her? Others, however, reacted with shock and sadness. Their children, a young mother countered. What harm could it do to acknowledge them? This feels cruel. The divide was generational, cultural, and profoundly emotional. The press amplified the split. Traditionalist outlets praised the Queen's foresight, framing the clause as part of her long-term vision for a streamlined, secure monarchy. They pointed to her lifelong dedication to duty, arguing that she understood better than anyone the dangers of diluting the institution. The Queen knew that the monarchy cannot be stretched to include every branch of the family, one columnist wrote. She acted not out of malice, but out of necessity. But progressive voices painted a different picture. They called the clause exclusionary, outdated, and even discriminatory. Opinion pieces filled newspapers with headlines questioning whether the monarchy could survive in a world that increasingly valued inclusivity. On social media, the debate was even fiercer. Hashtags trended in opposing directions, some defending the monarchy, others rallying behind Harry and Meghan. Memes, threads, and videos dissected every angle. One post showing side-by-side images of William's children with their titles and Harry's without went viral, captioned simply, "Two families, one bloodline, two futures." The comments beneath it were a battlefield, one side claiming fairness, the other crying injustice. The digital space reflected the wider nation. A community once united in mourning for the Queen now splintered over her legacy. The political class was not immune to the division. Members of Parliament were asked to weigh in, some cautiously supporting the Queen's judgment, while others used the moment to question the monarchy's relevance altogether. In Scotland, where independence debates already carried the monarchy as a backdrop, the clause was seized upon as evidence of a distant, outdated institution. In the Caribbean, leaders who had already been considering removing the monarchy as head of state pointed to Archie and Lilibet's exclusion as proof that the crown was incapable of embracing modern values. A decision made in Windsor rippled across the Commonwealth, shaking the very foundations of allegiance. Within Britain, the divide was generational as much as political. Older citizens, who had lived their lives under the Queen's steady reign, tended to defend her. They saw her decision as part of the same discipline that had guided her through wars, scandals, and crises. But among younger people, sympathy leaned strongly toward Harry and Meghan. Many saw themselves in the couple, struggling with family rejection, grappling with identity, fighting against systems that seemed unyielding. Polls reflected this divide, showing a sharp decline in support for the monarchy among those under 30, while older generations remained steadfast. The divide was not only ideological, but deeply personal. Families across Britain found themselves arguing at dinner tables, their conversations echoing the larger debate. One household in Manchester split between a grandmother who believed the Queen had acted rightly and her granddaughter, who believed Archie and Lilibet had been wronged, became emblematic of the nation itself. It's not just about titles, the granddaughter insisted. It's about fairness. Her grandmother shook her head. It's about survival. The monarchy cannot afford sentiment. These conversations played out thousands of times, turning the Queen's will into a subject of national reflection on values, identity, and belonging. Meanwhile, protests began to stir. Outside Buckingham Palace, groups gathered with signs demanding justice for Archie and Lilibet. Some carried banners declaring, "All family deserves recognition," while others chanted slogans calling for the monarchy to modernize or step aside. On the other side of the divide, monarchist groups held their own rallies, waving Union Jacks and chanting their loyalty to the Queen's memory. These gatherings were peaceful for the most part, but the imagery of protesters facing off in front of the palace captured the sense of a nation wrestling with itself. The divide also seeped into the media's portrayal of Harry and Meghan. In sympathetic corners, they were framed as victims, their retreat from Windsor described in tender, emotional detail. Images of Meghan wiping tears, of Harry looking broken, were repeated endlessly. But in hostile outlets, their silence was painted as manipulation. They knew exactly what they were doing, one commentator scoffed. They're turning this into a narrative to win sympathy. The same event was interpreted through entirely different lenses, deepening the fracture in public perception. For Harry and Meghan, watching this from afar was both painful and illuminating. They saw the divide in the nation as confirmation of what they had felt within the family, that acceptance and rejection were lines drawn by tradition, by allegiance, by perception. They worried about how this division would affect their children one day. Would Archie and Lilibet grow up as symbols in a fight they never chose? Would they forever be caught between supporters and critics, praised by some, condemned by others? The thought haunted both parents, even as they tried to shield their children from the storm. The monarchy, for its part, attempted to maintain silence. Buckingham Palace issued no further comment, hoping that the storm would pass as others had before. But the silence did not unite, it widened the divide. In the absence of explanation, the public projected their own narratives, their own fears and hopes. The monarchy's very strategy of staying above the fray backfired, leaving many to believe its silence was indifference. The chapter closes with Britain standing at a crossroads. In living rooms, on social media, in Parliament, and across the Commonwealth, the question echoed: what kind of monarchy does the nation want? A monarchy rooted in tradition, unyielding in its definitions? Or a monarchy that adapts, that embraces all its branches, even those who have stepped away? The Queen's clause had drawn a line not only within her family, but across her nation. A nation once united in grief now stood divided in debate, its future uncertain, its trust in the monarchy shaken. The news of the Queen's will and its shocking clause had not only reignited debates about the monarchy, but had also stirred a ghost that never truly left the institution: Diana, Princess of Wales. Her presence, though she had been gone for decades, seemed to haunt every corner of the unfolding drama. For many watching, the exclusion of Archie and Lilibet was not simply a matter of titles. It was another chapter in the story Diana had lived and died within. The echoes of her life reverberated loudly, reminding the world that history, in the monarchy, has a cruel way of repeating itself. For Harry, those echoes were deafening. Sitting in the silence after the will's reading, his mind had gone immediately to his mother. He could hear her voice, recall her warmth, remember her relentless fight for recognition and love within the rigid confines of the crown. Diana had always spoken of protecting her sons, of ensuring that they would not be swallowed whole by the institution that had treated her so coldly. Yet here he was, watching the same coldness reach his children. The realization that his mother's battles had not ended with her death, but had instead passed to him, was almost too much to bear. Diana's story was one of defiance and vulnerability. She had entered the monarchy young, filled with hope and burdened by expectation, only to find herself crushed beneath its weight. She had been adored by the public, but alienated within the palace. Her humanity, her emotions, her willingness to show love, qualities that made her beloved outside the gates, had been seen as weaknesses inside them. For Harry, the exclusion of Archie and Lilibet was an unmistakable continuation of that legacy. His mother had been sidelined for her difference. Now his children were being sidelined for theirs. The public saw the connection too. Headlines soon drew parallels, some explicitly stating what many already felt. Diana's grandchildren faced the same coldness she once endured. Television panels revisited old footage of Diana, her interviews, her pleas for compassion. The infamous Panorama interview was replayed, with Diana's words, "There were 3 of us in this marriage," now discussed in the context of her family's ongoing fractures. The world was reminded of her pain, her isolation, and her desperate attempts to shield her boys from the very system that had hurt her. Supporters of Harry and Meghan seized on this connection, framing the Queen's clause as a betrayal of Diana's memory. Social media swelled with images of Diana holding young Harry, juxtaposed with photos of Meghan holding Archie. Captions read, "History repeats itself." Others wrote, "Diana fought for her sons, who will fight for her grandchildren." These sentiments spread quickly, reinforcing the sense that the monarchy had not learned from its past, but had instead doubled down on it. Within the family, the echoes of Diana were harder to ignore than ever. William, though aligned with the monarchy, could not escape his mother's shadow either. He had chosen a different path, seeking to honor her memory while staying firmly within the institution. Yet he, too, must have felt the weight of her legacy pressing down. His children had been embraced, protected, given the recognition Diana had once dreamed of for him. But his brother's children had been denied, echoing the imbalance that had always defined their lives. Though William remained silent in public, those close to him whispered that he, too, felt the sting of his mother's absence more sharply than ever. For Charles, Diana's ghost was perhaps the heaviest of all. As king, he had to uphold his mother's will. But as the man who had once clashed so bitterly with Diana, he could not escape the perception that her grandchildren had been cast aside in the same way she once had. The public had not forgotten their battles, their divorce, the way Diana had been left vulnerable in the face of the press. Now, with the Queen's will excluding Harry's children, many saw it as Charles's monarchy repeating the sins of the past. Even if the decision had not been his, he bore its burden. Harry himself spoke little in those days, but those closest to him described his grief as laced with anger, not only at the clause but at the realization that his mother's warnings had been right. She had told him to beware of the institution's coldness, to trust his instincts, to protect his heart. She had known that love alone could not survive inside the palace walls without sacrifice. Harry now saw the truth of her words more clearly than ever. His breaking point had come not just from his grandmother's decision, but from the awareness that his mother had foreseen it. Meghan, too, felt Diana's shadow. She had often been compared to her, sometimes flatteringly, sometimes cruelly. She had felt the weight of those comparisons in the press, in the whispers of courtiers, even in the expectations of the public. But now, she saw the connection as something deeper. 2 women, outsiders in different ways, who had both felt the monarchy's rejection. Meghan had never met Diana, but in the aftermath of the will, she felt closer to her than ever, as though Diana's story was no longer a chapter from the past, but a warning that had landed squarely in her lap. The echoes of Diana also reshaped the public's understanding of the Queen's clause. For many, it was not simply a matter of titles, but a test of whether the monarchy had learned from its history. And the answer, in their eyes, was no. The image of a grandmother excluding her great-grandchildren became inseparable from the image of Diana excluded and heartbroken. The monarchy's inability to embrace love, compassion, and difference was once again on display. Yet the echoes of Diana carried more than grief. They carried defiance too. Diana had left behind not only a story of pain, but a story of resilience. She had defied the monarchy, spoken her truth, and captured the world's love despite the institution's rejection. For Harry, that defiance became a blueprint. If the monarchy would not give his children a place, then he would give them a life beyond it, one filled with love, compassion, and freedom. For Meghan, Diana's legacy was both warning and inspiration. She saw in Diana's life the dangers of isolation, but also the power of authenticity. She vowed to ensure her children inherited not the monarchy's rejection, but Diana's strength. The chapter closes with Harry standing before a photograph of his mother in their California home. It is a picture of her smiling, radiant, alive in a way that the monarchy never allowed her to be. He stares at it, tears brimming in his eyes, whispering words only he can hear. In that moment, he knows the fight is not over. His children may have been denied titles, but they will not be denied love. Diana's echoes remind him of what has been lost, but they also remind him of what must be preserved. The monarchy may have chosen exclusion, but Harry chooses legacy, his mother's legacy of love, carried forward through Archie and Lilibet. The silence that followed the reading of the Queen's will was only the beginning. What lay ahead was not inscribed in any legal document, not written in the neat, measured words of a monarch's decree. It was the unwritten battle. A struggle that would play out in the hearts of Harry and Meghan, in the corridors of Buckingham Palace, and in the minds of millions who watched from afar. The clause denying Archie and Lilibet titles had been spoken with finality, but its consequences were far from settled. It had set in motion a conflict that would not be contained by paper and ink. Harry and Meghan returned to their California home, carrying more than grief. They carried questions, doubts, and the heavy burden of what to do next. Their retreat gave them space, but it did not give them answers. Should they remain silent, preserving their dignity while letting the clause stand uncontested? Or should they fight back, publicly challenging the monarchy, risking even greater division, but refusing to let their children's exclusion go unanswered? The battle was unwritten because it had no clear rules. Whatever choice they made would shape not only their own lives, but their children's futures. For Harry, the battle was deeply personal. He had grown up under the monarchy's shadow, bound by rules he never chose, defined by expectations he never wanted. He had fought to carve out his own identity, leaving the institution behind in search of freedom. But now, with his children marked by rejection, he felt a new fire kindling within him. The monarchy could dismiss him, could strip him of roles and duties, but it had crossed a line when it denied his children. In the quiet hours of the night, Harry wrestled with his anger, pacing as he imagined confronting his father, his brother, even the advisors who had whispered in the Queen's ear. Yet even as fury burned, sorrow anchored him. He knew that any fight would come at a cost, and the question was whether his children could bear it. Meghan's perspective was no less fierce. She had already endured the sharpest edges of the monarchy's disapproval, the whispers in the palace halls, the headlines that dissected her every gesture. She had felt the weight of rejection from the moment she stepped into royal life. Now, with her children's names carved into that same story of exclusion, her resolve hardened. She knew the world would paint her as ambitious, as manipulative, as the woman pulling Harry away from his family. But she also knew the truth. She was a mother, and a mother's instinct is to protect. In her silence, in her quiet fury, she began to sketch her own lines of defense. If the monarchy had chosen to cast them out, then she would ensure her children never looked back at the palace with longing. The unwritten battle also stirred within the walls of Buckingham Palace. For Charles, it was a storm he could not escape. As king, he had no power to alter his mother's will, but as father and grandfather, he bore the consequences. Advisors urged him to remain silent, to let the will speak for itself. Yet he knew silence was a decision in itself, one that pushed Harry and Meghan further away. Every day he hesitated, the divide grew deeper. He faced his own battle, whether to uphold the monarchy's image of unyielding tradition or to risk criticism by reaching across the divide to his son. William, too, faced conflict. His loyalty to the monarchy was unshakable, his duty to uphold its stability clear. Yet he could not entirely silence the voice inside that remembered Harry as his closest companion in childhood. The clause had secured his children's positions, but at the cost of his brothers. He knew the world saw the contrast, and he knew Harry saw it too. His battle was quieter, less visible, but no less real. Could he stand by silently while his brother's children were excluded? Or was his silence a betrayal that history would judge? Beyond the family, the unwritten battle unfolded in the court of public opinion. Each new headline, each commentary, each debate added fuel to the fire. The monarchy's supporters framed the clause as discipline. Harry and Meghan's defenders framed it as cruelty. The nation argued over the meaning of fairness, loyalty, and tradition. Across the Commonwealth, the decision fed debates about independence, with some nations citing the clause as proof that the monarchy could not adapt to modern values. The battle was not confined to Windsor or California. It was global. Harry and Meghan felt the pressure keenly. Their silence was strategic, but it was also heavy. Every day they remained quiet. Speculation grew. Some urged them to speak out, to confront the monarchy directly, to honor Diana's defiance by refusing to accept exclusion. Others warned them to hold their peace, to protect their children from further scrutiny. The unwritten battle was not only about what had been denied, but about how to respond. To fight too loudly risked appearing bitter. To remain too quiet risked appearing defeated. There was no easy path forward, only choices laced with consequence. At night, Harry found himself returning to Diana's memory again and again. He thought of her interviews, her willingness to speak truth even when it cost her everything. He thought of the strength she had shown in defiance of the monarchy's coldness. Part of him longed to follow her path, to raise his voice and refuse to be silenced. But another part of him, scarred by years of relentless media storms, feared dragging his children into the same cycle of exposure that had destroyed his mother. The unwritten battle was as much within him as it was outside him.